College football nerds, we're here talking Alabama and Georgia, probably the biggest game of the season so far, and we're going to kind of settle in and discuss this one for a little bit, maybe a little bit longer than our normal videos. Want to remind y'all, if you haven't already this season, hit that subscribe button. It helps us out a whole lot. But one more, and maybe more importantly, give us your score prediction in the comments below. You can tell us how crazy we are. We'll mix it up with you. Got Josh with me. We're going to get a little nerdy with y'all, more so than we have been this year. And look, there's going to be a lot of opinions in this video, and right now we still don't know what we don't know about this season, but we're not chasing clicks. We're not trying to make anybody happy. So you're going to get our unfiltered, unvarnished view of this game. Here we go. Josh, we saw that, I guess you want to call it, defensive display from Alabama on Saturday, and it was just embarrassing. It was. I tweeted in the middle of the Georgia game how refreshing it was to see a team play defense since we've seen so much offense this year. I loved it. I loved every minute of watching that Georgia-Tennessee game just from the standpoint of actual defense being played. So I was a little surprised when I woke up this morning and the first early line from Bovada was like 7. Then more official lines came out at 5, and then it got bought down pretty quick to 4.5, and then it stalled. Alabama favored in that number right now at the time of this recording, 4.5 points. We don't normally talk about spreads too much, maybe towards the end of the video. We don't normally talk about point spreads a whole lot, but you've got an opinion on where that point spread comes from, and I think it's a really interesting one as it relates to statistical offensive production from teams and what they might get and what they might allow. So I'm not going to lead it in anymore. Just talk to us about why, not necessarily what you're picking or what you think, but why you think and what you've seen in the numbers that would indicate why the spread is what it is and Georgia's not favored.
We looked at the spread because we were both really curious to see how Vegas was taking this game. And you can see what you want, but Vegas isn't stupid. When you see spreads, it's about, I would say 90% of the time, it's a fair reflection of where the two teams are. In football, we say this all the time. It's a variable sport. Games usually do not end at the point spread, okay? And I'll say, without even giving my pick here, I will tell you, I think the team that wins this game is going to win it by more than a touchdown, whoever it is. However, there are also spreads that are traps. I was pretty vocal last week, and I'm going to toot my own horn, that the Texas A&M Florida game was a trap. I felt that Texas A&M was going to win. I picked Texas A&M to win, and as a part of that, I noted that the spread did not make any sense, that Vegas was pushing people to pick Florida in that game. I was kind of curious what we'd see here, and I think it's almost bizarre that Alabama is favored, because I think the public perception based, especially of last week, is that Georgia's playing much better football than Alabama. Based on that, I kind of wanted to dig into the stats and try to figure out why the heck that is. Like, why would Vegas, in a hypothetical, all right, like Vegas set the point spread as Alabama favored, why might they do that? The answer may come from a concept that we talk about a lot, which is stall points and, I would say, a breaking point, or a stall point and a breakaway point for an offense. When you're playing offense, you generally need a certain amount of yardage to be able to move the sticks. And I'll call that, for lack of a better term, a stall point. I've talked about this concept a lot, and, like, I'll even say, like, we've had conversations with other channels, like Land Grant Holy Land, or I've had conversations with Josh Pate about it over the past few years. If you're not getting that kind of production, your offense tends to crater, right? You'll go from a certain number, and then it'll half, and then it'll half again. And the reason for that is when you're not quite getting the production, you need to, certain plays start getting thrown off the table. You end up in 3rd and long. You're not moving the chains. You're not wearing out the other defense. Stuff snowballs. Likewise, there's a certain point offensively where I would call it a breakaway point. If you get a certain amount of production, the other team can never force you into 3rd down. The other team can never force you into a negative play where you can recover too easily. If you're getting, and it's usually about 8 yards per play, 7.5 to 8 yards per play, the other team just doesn't stop you and you score at will. And so there's almost always a range, and it's usually from about 4.5 yards per play to about 8 yards per play where teams exist. And that's where most offenses produce, and your scoring really floats from the low end to the high end within that range. Our model, I will say, works on that concept. And a lot of my model concepts that, if you know this channel, we've been around for years running this model. And if you've heard it from any other channel, I'm telling you, this is the base concept where that model was built on. I think this game hinges around stall points and break points. And let me explain what that means and how it relates to the two teams in question. In the Alabama Ole Miss game, Alabama allowed 7.52 yards per play. And I said about 7.5 yards per play is what I would consider a normal breaking point or breakaway point. If you can hit that number, you generally go off the rails, particularly in a spread offense. I will say if you have a much more pro-style offense, I used to complain about Les Miles. They needed 5 or 6 or 7 yards per play to function. But in the new RPO spread world, if you can get 7.5 yards per play and you're running a zone read offense, you're almost unstoppable. So Ole Miss is at 7.5. They scored 48 points. Well, where was A&M at? They were at 5.8 yards per play and scored 24 points. That is only a 22% decrease per play from Ole Miss. And it halved the scoring production. Now, A&M, I believe, entered the Alabama 35-yard line 8 times in that game. But the difference between 5.8 yards per play and 7.5 was in A&M's ability to overcome negative plays, sacks, and mistakes and Ole Miss's. Ole Miss was infrequently in a third and short situation and usually was manageable. They had a couple big third down conversions, but they also had several instances where they had to go for it on fourth down and convert it. A&M had a lot more third and longs and a lot more third and unmanageables or negative plays. And that extra 2 to 3 yards per play is the difference between 3rd and 4 or 4th and 4 and 3rd and 8 or 4th and 8. And that changes a lot of things you can do offensively, and it changes a lot of things that can be done defensively. So the other thing I want to talk about, and before I flip it back to you, and I know this is a long segment, but I think this is a hugely important concept to this game, is where Georgia's at offensively and where their breaking points are. So offensively against Auburn, Georgia was at 6.05 yards per play. Against Tennessee, they were at 5.6. And against Arkansas, I won't throw that one out, but it was only 4.3. I don't think many people realize that Georgia actually had a lower per play average against Tennessee than they did against Auburn, despite the fact that they scored an extra 17 points in the game. I think if you're a Georgia fan, you knew you were more effective against Auburn generally than you were against Tennessee. But it's a bit deceptive that that number wasn't all that high. And I think the other problem here is Georgia's offense at 5.6-ish yards per play against a good but not great Tennessee defense is in a lot more trouble of hitting one of those breaking points than Alabama's offense. Alabama's offense is actually averaging 8.7 yards per play on the season. They were 10.2 against Ole Miss, and they were 9.9 against Texas A&M. So the concept we fleshed out here is there's a certain point where your offense craters, and there's a certain point where it blows away. If that number is about 7.5, that means Alabama's offense, if you took 25% of their production away, would still hit 7.5 yards per play and would still probably score 40 points per more. If Georgia was held to, let's say, 25% under their average, then you end up with something below the Arkansas result, about 4 yards per play, and you're probably only looking at something like 20 to 30 points. Now, Georgia's defense is a lot better than Alabama's defense, and it's likely that Georgia holds Alabama a lot more under their average than Alabama can hold Georgia under their average. But the problem is Georgia has to. If Georgia doesn't hold Alabama to maybe 50% of their average, if Alabama holds Georgia to 80% of their numbers and Georgia holds Alabama to 50, then Georgia is looking at somewhere around 4.8 yards per play. Alabama, even at half their average, is looking at somewhere around 4.8 yards per play. It's the same number. So Georgia and Alabama, despite having radically different defenses, Alabama's offense is so far ahead that even an elite performance by Georgia can put them on even playing field. And then you get into scheme and efficiency of offense and all, and Alabama's RPO scheme may actually give them an advantage with the same yardage versus Georgia's power run scheme, which I already talked about with Les Miles. That power run scheme requires a lot more yardage to be successful. So very, very long segment, but I think that's the kind of key to the game, and I think it's really interesting and really builds on a lot of concepts this channel's talked about for 3 to 4 years.
And Georgia fans are going to hear what you said as a pretext to Georgia's not going to win the game, and Georgia can't slow Alabama down, and all of that. And I'm going to give a counter perspective to that because I think there's a lot good there, especially if you think that Alabama has a decent defense. My concern for this game, if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm thinking, okay, I saw Ole Miss put up 48 on my team Saturday night. What if I don't even have a decent defense? What if Alabama's defense is worse, including Arkansas, which is a possibility based on what we've seen this year? What if Alabama's defense is worse than anything Georgia saw this season so far, and they get 110, 120% of what they're used to? Then it's a whole different ballgame. And I think, y'all, this is a distinct possibility because of not only what we've seen from Alabama, but they just had to have a knockdown, drag out 12 rounds with Ole Miss. They're not going to be fresh Saturday. And they have to start the first half of this game without their best safety, and they don't have any good safeties, even with their best safety in the game. So that's a real concern. Talk to me a little bit about the possibility that Alabama doesn't hold Georgia to 80%, but it's more like Georgia hits 120% because Alabama's defense is legitimately bad. And talk to me about how, in my mind, tell me if you agree, it's the middle. It's the interior defensive linemen, interior linebackers, and safeties. Middle all the way up the field is a big concern.
Alabama, their struggles are kind of hard to peg down. And as I said, I went back and I rewatched the Alabama Ole Miss game, specifically trying to look at pass defense and figure out what was going wrong with them, because I think that's one of the bigger storylines, not only so far this year, but may turn out to be one of the pivotal storylines of the season. The impression I got is Alabama's defensive line is solid, but no more. They generally hold point. They are not an elite unit like we've seen from the past. They're rotating some guys in to account for it. And you see like DJ Dale, the starting nose guard. I don't know if he's injured or what, but he's not as good as he was last year. And so they've started to play number 58 Barmore more. But what I noticed, like there's a big run in that game where he doesn't play his assignment and he's being single blocked, and rather than push the pocket, he tries to throw his guy aside and sort of stun around him. As soon as he does that, or as he does it, it turns out Ole Miss is running a running back draw. And the running back, Ely, who is an NFL prospect, just shoots right up the middle and goes for something like 40 yards on that play. That's Alabama's problem on the front, but for the most part, they are pretty athletic. I think Ray is maybe an underrated player for them, is pretty disruptive from what I saw. The rest of them are all kind of rotational role guys, nothing special. Corner on the outside, Alabama is actually extremely good. Job and Surtain are not being thrown out hardly at all. When they do thrown out, they have an incredibly high pass breakup rate. In terms of outside corners, probably as good or better than anybody in the country, frankly. The problem is the other guys in the middle are bad. And what's funny is they've got a freshman at nickel corner, and he got picked on a lot early, but quite frankly, he's holding his own. That's Malachi Moore. But like you said, safety and linebacker are the issue. And first thing I want to establish here, Dylan Moses came back. He's a preseason All-American. He's a Butkus finalist. He is not playing well. I don't know if it's an injury issue, if it's another issue. We talked about in the past a couple of years ago when Moses was a star linebacker for them and was healthy. He frequently didn't seem to know what he was doing, and he missed his assignments a lot. That's still happening. He's more than a step slow. He frequently didn't get out to the running back in coverage, and it's causing them a lot of issues. And I think right now Christian Harris is actually the better linebacker in that linebacking group, and the inability of Moses to play at the level that was expected has been pretty crippling of them, particularly now that teams realize he has that issue, and they're doing a lot of stuff motioning receivers and running backs to try to get him thinking, and he's just caught flat-footed. Behind that, at the safety position, what I saw in film is they've got a guy in Battle that is a good all-around safety and a good run stopper. And they've got a guy in Wright that is actually a pretty darn good cover safety, but a really poor tackler and just kind of struggles in space. So they would rotate around a lot where Battle gets rotated down to the line of scrimmage and Wright is being dropped back. And for the most part, it worked. But if they could ever get the ball caught in front of Wright, he usually didn't make the tackle. And it doesn't take many of those at the safety position when you're playing somebody that's four wide for that to be a huge play. Because if the safety misses the tackle, there ain't anybody else to make it. I think the problem for Alabama now is that they're going to be out battled for the first half, which means now you have Wright and Helms. And you got a problem where Helms, if he was in the right position, generally made the tackle, but he was not frequently in the right position and gave up several big plays where he clearly is a player that hasn't played many snaps. And you got a guy in Wright that was usually in the right position but couldn't make the tackle. I don't know how they're going to do it with both those guys. And given that they're playing a guy in Stetson Bennett that really loves to throw over the middle of the field, I think it's a major issue for Alabama because a lot like, I guess it was an SEC championship game maybe a couple years ago, I think Georgia could have a lot of success of just throwing to tight ends and running backs short on easy plays, relying on a guy that is a guy in Bennett that's a very good player that understands his system, and exploiting the fact that the safeties and linebackers don't know their assignments, despite the fact that the corners are absolutely elite and the defensive line is actually pretty good. But none of it matters because there's just so frequently either an uncovered player coming out of the backfield or a tight end or somebody catching it over the middle where there's a broken tackle that goes for some big play on third down or a 40-yard gain on first down.
So I want to talk about what both teams are doing well right now. And obviously, for Alabama, that's offensively, they look unstoppable. I'm going to take Alabama's offense. I'd like for you to take Georgia's defense, even though, I mean, I've bragged on them on Twitter. I've talked to them already here. We even talked about it in our preseason preview. Just they were probably going to be the best in the country. I want you to talk about the defense. I'll take Alabama's offense. Look, they're scary good. And you were telling me in our kind of lead-in discussion before we started talking about or hit the record button, we were comparing notes, and you were like, I think in this offense, Mac Jones is playing better than Tua did for Alabama the last 2 years. And not to say that Jones is a better quarterback, but just in this system, the reads he's making, the throws he's making, he's better than Tua, which is scary because they were setting records with Tua. I think I agree with that. At least what we've seen so far. My concern is he's played some bad defenses. Missouri's not a terrible defense, but they've got a bad defensive line or a weak defensive line. Ole Miss has the worst run defense I've ever seen. So some of this is hard to know what we're looking at. But also remember, Mac Jones in Alabama put up 45 on Auburn last year, and that was his first real start. So they are capable of putting up gobs of points. My position is, and when you talk about Georgia's defense, tell me if you agree. My position is you're not going to beat Alabama if you don't score 35. True or false?
I would agree with that.
Okay, so I think that, but I also think that if a defense is elite and holds them to 35, that's a really good night. So can Georgia hold Alabama to 35 and explain why that's not an insult that we're putting it at that number to Georgia's defense?
We just did an entire video on past defenses in the SEC, and I actually think, not just knocking on wood, I think this is one of the more interesting videos we've done in a long time. But one of the takeaways from that is you've got 10 teams in the SEC right now allowing 8 yards per attempt in conference play. Last year, there were only 4 that did that. There's a lot going on with COVID, but there's also a lot going on in the current era of college football. Teams put up more yardage, teams put up more points. And I think the reality is, even if you're a top shelf defense, when you play high level offenses in today's game, you tend to give up points because the RPO is unfairly slanted towards the offense. The fact that, like, I will say, rewatching that Ole Miss game, Ole Miss ran 4 or 5 illegal picks that were never really picked up on. And that's just allowed. And it just throttled Alabama. And it's going to throttle any defense, including Georgia. There's not really any counter to that. That kind of stuff means if you're playing a high-level offense and they're operating efficiently, there are too many plays you can't properly defend anymore. And because of that, you're throwing at Devontae Smith, you're throwing at Jalen Waddle. They're going to get points and they're going to put points on the board. But I think the question is really, can you hold Alabama to 30 or 40 given their defensive issues? Because I don't know that Georgia can score more. So if it's cool with you, I'd kind of like to go in a little bit about how Georgia matches up defensively and why I'm so impressed with them.
Sure, you haven't had a long segment yet, so go ahead.
The short answer for Georgia is that they're really signing sound, and I'll let you pick up on this because I know you're in awe of them as well. But Ojolari and even to some extent guys like Nolan Smith really created a lot of havoc last week against a very, very good Tennessee offense that had multiple five-star players in the offensive line. We talked about going into that. It was a very good offensive line, and they still got a ton of havoc. Now, some of that was because Garantano holds the ball entirely too long, but there's a ton of pressure. And that, first off, if you can get pressure, that makes everything else better. If Alabama had an elite defensive line like they had a few years ago, it would hide a whole heck of a lot of warts because these running backs or tight ends leaking out, you wouldn't have time to find them and get the ball to them. Second, the tight ends and running backs don't leak out on Georgia's defense and end up wide open. The linebackers know the system extremely well. Monty Rice has played for years. Nakobe Dean is a very talented, very instinctive linebacker that is extremely good in space. And does really tremendous things for Georgia in terms of not letting them ever have significant matchup disadvantages in the passing game. And then the secondary, again, it's just extremely talented. It is extremely consistent. One of the things that struck me in that Tennessee game is that while Tennessee put some points on the board, and again, if you've got really high-level receiver and quarterback play, that's going to happen. The points that were scored on Georgia were contested points. The thing that has always driven me insane watching like a Conference USA game, and I am a football snob, I can't watch that kind of football, is uncontested passes. It's a guy is, quote, in coverage, but he never gets his head around. He doesn't make a play on the ball. And it's like, look, you might as well not be there. The wide receiver's running a route, and if I know that's the way you're going to play defense, I'm just going to throw the ball to the wide receiver, and I'm going to assume it's either going to hit the defensive back in the back or the other guy's going to catch it because he's never going to get his head around and intercept it. I don't see that with Georgia ever, especially this year. They are always contesting the play. They are always where the ball is. Nothing is ever a catch and run. Everything's run down, and it makes it tough, and you have to be extremely consistent defensively. And really, it's the only defense in the past few years, outside Clemson, who did the same thing. And, I'll say in that 2018 season, Georgia and Clemson both gave Alabama absolute fits because they both did this. Contested Alabama up and down the field, and Alabama kind of folded in, both those games offensively because they weren't really prepared or willing or consistent enough to have an 8-play drive or a 10-play drive where they had to actually not, score a 40-yard bomb, but work the field in the middle of the field and drive it down. That's the thing that impresses me so much about Georgia. And I would actually say if Tua was still here, I would be even more concerned because Tua was such a boom or bust guy and was always looking for the big play. The only thing I will say that offsets it, and this is what you said about my comment with Mac Jones, is Jones is doing a better job of actually taking what the defense is giving him, throwing the ball short, being happy with it, doing the check down, throwing some actually very good read plays, hot routes and stuff inside that aren't huge arm talent plays that are going to make him the highest draft pick in the world, but are plays that are going to make your offense a hell of a lot more effective. But despite that, Georgia, their ability to contest every play while generating pressure just makes them a tremendous defense.
For me, the key to this game is you have a unit in Georgia's offense that is nowhere near as good as their defense. A unit in Alabama's defense is nowhere near as good as their offense. Which one of those can play closer to good or normal and let the other unit do what they do? Because if Alabama their defense has dug them a hole that their offense has to dig them out of all night, it could be a long night. And kind of as you touched on in the open, if Georgia's offense is just a little bit worse than they normally are, they're not going to be able to keep pace with Alabama. And I know Georgia fans are going to be like, look, we got the best defense in the country. Alabama is putting up buckets of points on crappy defenses, and we saw what happened when they did this in 2018, and they hit Clemson and they couldn't score. That is a real possibility. I'm telling you right now, it's not going to happen. They're going to score points. The problem for Alabama is they're absolutely going to give up points. I think we can go ahead and get into our predictions and maybe talk about it after. I've got Georgia in this game, and I'm going against my gut because I think, look, Alabama's defense is not going to be as bad as they were last week. But we've seen enough of these remnants of the same problem, namely the run defense, which is weird for a Saban team. Enough remnants of this problem to know that Georgia can take advantage of it enough that their defense can do enough to survive. I do think it's going to be kind of a shootout because they're going to give up points. But man, I just, after watching Alabama give up, I think 5 or 6 consecutive touchdowns to Ole Miss, who I think, by the way, Georgia fans are going to roll their eyes. Ole Miss has a better offense by a pretty good clip than Georgia. Ole Miss has a top 10 in the country offense. But I think Georgia's offense is good enough to put up some points. Give me 37-34 Georgia and tell me what you think about that.
The first thing I would say is I've already established I think the team that wins this game is going to win by more than 7. I could be wrong. It could be a last-second shootout. Of course, that could happen. I just think whoever's falling behind in this game is going to be in real trouble. If we saw this in the Georgia-Tennessee game, right? Tennessee was leading that game at the half. They come out in the second half. They make a couple mistakes. They get down a couple scores, and it just absolutely implodes. Garantino gets in his own head. Georgia's able to bring pressure because they're playing with a lead, and everything falls behind. If Alabama's in the same situation and Georgia's able to bring continual pressure, I've never seen Mac Jones really fold under that pressure, but he hasn't played a lot of games, and he might. But at the very least, I think Georgia's ability to pin their ears back and get after Alabama in that situation would be kind of Alabama's undoing. Likewise, I think if Georgia ends up having to really throw downfield with Bennett, I have doubts. And that actually gets into the thing that kind of decides the game for me. We've had this whole discussion of one team's ability to hold the other team to lesser yardage. The difficulty for me in predicting this game is trying to evaluate how Monken's offense is going to translate in a game with a better, at least a more talented defense with a better secondary than what Tennessee presented. And make no mistake, Tennessee is a good defense. We talked about that a lot. They were, I think, they're probably as good as Alabama on the defensive line, maybe better than Alabama on the defensive line. They've got a great linebacker in Tuoto, though I will say without Johnson, their linebacking core was really deficient at the other inside slot, and Georgia was able to exploit that to an insane degree. That doesn't make them necessarily better than Alabama. I'm just saying you may get a preview of some of the stuff they did. They're going to have some of the same advantages there. Across the board, otherwise, I think it's kind of a wash, except that Alabama is more talented and a much more lockdown at corner. I think the question is, how well can Stetson Bennett keep pace against a good defense in a game where he's going to need to? The thing that killed Alabama against Ole Miss more than anything else when I rewatched that game was Matt Corral's athleticism and arm talent. Matt Corral was an Army All-American. He was the number 63 overall recruit. If you think this is crazy, he was a high 4-star, I think at one point even a 5-star consideration player. 24/7 Sports had him a 10 out of 10 in arm strength. He is an absolutely elite talent, but they had him, I think, 5 or 6 out of 10 on intangibles, which was a nice way of saying he doesn't understand offenses very well. In Kiffin's scheme, he was great, and he killed Alabama because they were running zone read concepts. He kept getting outside the pocket, kept extending plays. Alabama had to spy him. Georgia and Alabama fans are both very familiar with this, running the very similar defensive schemes that are very man press. It's hard to play man coverage against a guy that does that, contain him in the pocket, and then you can't play man coverage forever. You eventually lose a guy. Can Stetson Bennett recreate that? And he's a very athletic guy. He's really good outside the pocket. There's two things he doesn't have. One is he doesn't have Matt Corral's arm. There was a play where Matt Corral threw against his body on a 3rd and 19, gets outside the pocket, turns, and just rips it about 20 yards downfield and hits a guy that had hit a void in the zone. Stetson Bennett is not going to make that throw. Not against his body, not with anywhere near the same velocity. I also think Bennett is going to give Alabama issues with his athleticism, but he's still not quite the size runner that Corral is. So my take here is I think Alabama can actually sort of close the pocket on Georgia, keep him inside, and not let him extend plays and try to keep pace. And because of that, I think Georgia does get held to something like 20-25% of their average. They're going to end up more in like the 4.5 range. And I think Georgia's going to struggle to get Alabama to more than like 40% of their average. Maybe 6 yards per play to 4 yards per play. And if that's the case, that's enough for Alabama to pull away. I would have more faith in this game if I had seen a more consistent running game from Georgia. Kendall Milton was very effective against Tennessee. Zamir White ended up with 2.3 yards per carry on 22 carries. His long in the game was only 9 yards. I don't think that's going to get it done. You need more explosiveness against Alabama. Alabama, because their issues are misdirection, they struggled with the speed of Ole Miss's running backs. That's not Georgia's strength. I think a lot of this stuff lines up to give Alabama a slight edge. I would say 60-40 that Alabama wins in my mind. I do pick Alabama. I pick Alabama to win this game 37-27. I don't think it's really a 10-point game. I think it's one where Georgia gets in late, Alabama gets a score and is able to put it away. It would absolutely not surprise me if this score is flipped, but I think if you're a Georgia fan and you want to disagree with me, it's going to come down to one simple thing. Tennessee was able to contain Stetson Bennett in the pocket. They played sort of a mush rush, and they said, we're going to make you throw over the middle. Bennett has really struggled with throws over coverage, meaning where he has to drop the ball over. He is kind of a sidearm thrower, and he reminds me a lot of Baker Mayfield up to about 15 yards, where he can turn and sort of rip it and make these point throws. But he's very short. I'm thinking he's listed 5'11". I'm guessing he's more like 5'9", 5'10". And when he has to throw up and over, his arcing balls are inaccurate, and they have very little zip. If he can move the pocket, get outside the pocket, and operate in his comfort zone, his understanding of the offense is going to give Georgia the edge, and they're going to win. If Alabama can keep him in the pocket, and he continues to struggle making throws over linemen and over linebackers, then the offense is going to slow down too much. They won't keep pace. They won't hit 30, and they're going to lose. To me, that's the ball game.
And Georgia fans are going to definitely come at you because, one, we picked Auburn to beat Georgia. And look, we ate our crow on that, but it's really one of those things where, like, you just barely beat, or you were losing to Arkansas at the half last week. We don't know what to expect from you, and they came out and beat Auburn. And now looking back at Auburn, barely with a gift from the refs beating Arkansas, Auburn's a bad team. We've said in the past that doesn't matter. Like, if you play a bad team and you beat them handily, that it doesn't matter if they're bad. But the concern for me, and I'm still picking Georgia, but the concern for me for Georgia fans that are going to come at us in the comments and say we're crazy is, look, you ran for 3.9 yards per carry versus Tennessee. Stetson Bennett had a good day, but the 44 points was statistically anomalous relative to your offensive production. So I don't know that you get 44 against Tennessee or against Alabama based on what you did against Tennessee and Auburn. Auburn's defense is not that great this year. They gave up 28 to Arkansas. They're not great. But on the flip side, I think while Georgia's offense is not as good as Georgia fans want to believe it is, based on a little bit of early season fool's gold, I don't think Alabama's putting up 63 on everybody. I think a lot of their offense is baked in really good. It's a great offense, but I think some of the numbers we're seeing is based on the fact that they've seen some really bad, and I'm talking Ole Miss, that defense is embarrassing. Really bad defenses that has aided their offensive production. So, Josh, give me a parting shot on this. Just one last thing, if you wanted to tie this in a bow, that you'd like to say about this game.
I'm really conflicted on this pick. This morning, I was probably going to pick Georgia. I went on a walk with my wife, and I talked through the statistical stuff and the breaking points. And that's when I went back and looked at the total yardage stats, and I kind of changed my mind and said, you know what? Basically, Alabama at 10 yards per play is so good that they can lose 40% of their production and still score 30. And that's where it got me. I will say Alabama's in the Oklahoma problem, right? Once you have 10 yards per play, it doesn't really matter if you hit 15. You're going to get the same number of points because the only thing stopping you is a turnover. But their defense is bad enough that other teams can stay in the game. So if they turn it over enough, they're going to lose. If a team turns the ball over enough in this game, they're going to lose. And I can't get out of my mind that everything is set up for the 2018 Georgia-Alabama game for most of the way that game went for most of the time, where Georgia was commanding the game with really simple, just sort of simple misdirection plays to the running backs and tight ends out of the backfield, followed by counter power plays up the middle. and linebackers were struggling with the misdirection stuff, and so they weren't filling holes, and Alabama was just gouging them down the field slowly but surely and scoring points. And then Alabama was really struggling with Georgia's pressure. The only reason that I'm not going with that is I have a lot more confidence that Mac Jones is not going to sit back there and try to throw bombs against, 3-deep zone and bracketed coverage the way Tua did and nearly lost him that game. I think Mac Jones is going to be a little more likely to throw against pressure and keep Georgia more honest defensively. But it's a close game with a lot of different variables involved. And, I'm really, really fascinated to see how it turns out.
And look, my last thing on this in defense of you, even though I'll say it for the third time, I still think Alabama's defense is so bad that Georgia's going to win this game. For Georgia fans who think they're going to come out one and dominate Alabama, they've only lost a 1-2 score game in the history since 2006. Once have they lost a 2-score game. That was Clemson, the national championship game. Look at what it takes to beat Alabama. It's, I think, 48 from Auburn. It was 40-something from LSU last year, and that's a team that dominated Georgia, that Alabama hung with every step of the way. It's, so if you don't think you need 35 to beat Alabama, you need to think again. The issue for Alabama is Georgia can absolutely get 35 in this game. All right, y'all, let us know what you think in the comments about your score, and you can tell us where we were right or where we were wrong, but back it up with data. Bring us some points other than, Tide's going to roll. They put up 63 last week and blah, blah, blah. Give us something good, and we'll engage in the comments. And remember, have a great week, and God bless.